The Wilson home in a quiet suburb of Kansas looked like the epitome of the American dream. The spacious two-story house surrounded by green lawns was where Thomas and Ava had grown up and where their family had lived in harmony and prosperity for many years. But, as in many families, the outward tranquility concealed a storm that was gradually brewing within. Thomas had turned 18 only a few months before. Outwardly, he was a calm and confident boy who was successful in academics and sports. His sister Ava, also 18, was his complete opposite, a more reserved, dreamy girl, immersed in her own thoughts and passionate about art. Despite their differences, brother and sister were always very close. Since childhood, they had spent a lot of time together, sharing their thoughts and experiences with each other. But in recent months, their relationship had taken a different, forbidden turn. They both realized that what was happening between them was wrong. The feelings that had started a year ago when they were still in high school were slowly growing into something far more dangerous than simple affection. They couldn't ignore the spark that arose every time their hands accidentally touched, or the electric tension that hung in the air whenever they were alone together. One day after dinner, Thomas sat in his room, flipping through pages of textbooks as usual, trying to focus on his college preparations. His mind was spinning with thoughts of Ava that kept him busy. He thought about the way she had smiled at him at his desk, the way her eyes had shone with a special light that he had only noticed for the past few months. Ava, in the meantime, couldn't find a place to be either. In her room, she was doodling in her sketchbook, but all her thoughts were of Thomas. Every glance, every chance meeting of his eyes left a trace in her mind, as if they were not just moments, but parts of some inevitable and irreversible process. At last, she could stand it no longer. Walking to the door of her room, Ava walked silently down the hallway, stopping in front of the door of her brother's room. Knocking quietly, she waited for an answer and slowly entered. "Thomas?" Her voice was barely audible. He looked up from his textbooks and looked at his sister. Their gazes met, and in that moment, a strange, dense silence hung in the room. They knew what they were silent about, but neither dared to say it out loud. "Are you all right?" Ava asked, even though she knew the answer. Thomas nodded, putting the book aside. "Yeah, just trying to focus on my studies." He paused. "But honestly, it's hard to think about anything else." Ava silently sat down on the edge of his bed, and for a few moments their world narrowed to a small room with no one else but them. They didn't speak, but their secret thoughts hovered in the air, filling the silence like a thick fog. "Thomas, we can't go on like this," she finally whispered, as if it made her words less real. Thomas wanted to say that she was right, that they should stop, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew he should have said it, but instead, he reached out and took her hand. For a moment, they just sat there holding hands, but that touch said it all for them. They couldn't stop. The feelings burning in their hearts were too strong to be suppressed. "I know," he said at last, "but I can't stop, Ava. I've tried. I really have, but I can't." His words were simple, but they hid the deep pain and guilt they both shared. Ava squeezed his hand a little tighter and tears glistened in her eyes. She lowered her head, trying to hide her weakness, but Thomas already understood. "We have to do something, Thomas. This can't go on forever. Someone will find out, sooner or later." Thomas understood her fears, but at that moment he was more afraid of what would happen if they stopped. They had become dependent on each other like drowning men clinging to the last piece of wood in the ocean. Michael, Thomas's best friend, began to notice the change in his friend's behavior a long time ago. They had always been like brothers, sharing everything from school secrets to future plans. But recently, Thomas had become distant, as if something was weighing him down inside. He avoided talking about girls, although earlier they had discussed cute classmates and upcoming parties together. Now Michael felt that Thomas was hiding something. One day when Michael came to visit them, he noticed that Ava had changed too. Her behavior was strange. She avoided Michael, even though they had always talked on equal terms before. Thomas, on the other hand, was even more withdrawn and aloof. After this incident, Michael began to observe how Thomas and Ava behaved when they were together. He saw their furtive glances, the awkward touches that seemed too intimate for simple brother-sister communication. Michael didn't want to jump to conclusions, but suspicions were already beginning to form in his mind. One evening, as Thomas and Michael strolled through the park, Michael decided he couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Tom, what's been going on with you lately? It's like you've changed," Michael began, trying not to sound too pushy. Thomas looked at him tensely, trying to hold back the wave of emotion that was rising inside. He couldn't tell Michael the truth, but it was getting harder and harder to keep hiding it either. "It's nothing, Michael. I've just been thinking a lot about the future," Thomas answered, trying to sound as casual as possible. "You know, college, plans, all that." Michael squinted his eyes, not believing his words. "College, huh? What about Ava? You two have been acting kind of weird lately." Thomas froze. Michael's words hit him like a hammer. Now his friend was closer to the truth than ever. Thomas knew that if Michael guessed what was really going on, it would be the end. Late one night, when everyone in the Wilson house was already asleep, Thomas sat in the kitchen, tapping his fingers nervously on the countertop. He waited for Ava, knowing she would show up soon. Their parents were out of town for the weekend, and it gave them a brief respite, a chance to spend time alone together without fear of being seen. Footsteps on the stairs sounded like a signal. Ava slowly descended, dressed in a loose t-shirt and house shorts. When she approached Thomas, there was a silence between them, full of tension and unspoken emotion. "I thought you'd gone to bed by now," she said quietly, sitting down across from him. Thomas looked at her, his heart beating faster. There was a shared secret in their eyes, and now everything depended on a single step. Thomas took her hand, squeezed her fingers lightly, and felt her touch in return. It was more than just a gesture. They both knew they could no longer contain themselves. "I couldn't sleep," he answered, trying to speak calmly. "I was thinking about you." The words sent an inner shiver down Ava's spine, as if he were confessing something intimate. They had always tried to talk as if it were something ordinary, unimportant, but this was different. "Me too," she whispered, not taking her eyes off him. At that moment, the space between them disappeared. Thomas rose from his seat, walked over to his sister, and without thinking, ran his fingers along her cheek. Ava sighed softly, her breathing hitched, and as if on an inner impulse, she reached for him. Their lips met, and the kiss was no longer a mistake or an accident. It was a decision to stop fighting. Ava felt her body tense and then relax in his arms. The fears that had plagued them both vanished, giving way to a desire they couldn't resist. They no longer thought about what was happening. There was only touch, gentle but demanding at the same time, as if they were afraid of missing this moment. Thomas pulled her against him, feeling the warmth of her body, the softness of her hair, feeling her arms wrap around his neck and her breathing become more and more rapid. They drowned in their feelings, losing control. Each new kiss was like stepping over a line they could never return to. The next morning, Thomas woke up in his room feeling a strange mix of emotions, from euphoria to a deep sense of guilt. He lay staring at the ceiling, realizing that he and Ava had finally crossed that line beyond which there was no going back. He knew they'd done something wrong, but that couldn't change the fact that the desire hadn't gone away. It was growing. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became regular. They would sneak out of the house during free time when his parents were busy or absent. Every kiss they shared, every touch, seemed to only intensify their attraction, though it made their existence even more precarious. Thomas became even more aloof. He could no longer act as he had before. His feelings for Ava filled his entire mind, crowding out everything else. He spent less and less time with his friends and hardly spoke to his parents. Ava had changed too. Her dreamy nature had become even more withdrawn. Now they lived in a world of their own, where it was just the two of them, but fear haunted them as well. They were afraid that someone would find out. Every time Thomas looked at Michael, he felt a wave of anxiety rising inside. His friend kept asking questions, trying to find out what was happening to him. Thomas was finding it increasingly difficult to lie, and he realized that their secret couldn't stay unsolved for long. One evening, when he and Ava met again in a secluded corner of the park, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The wind gently ruffled the leaves of the trees, and in the darkness, only their footsteps and the quiet rustle of leaves underfoot could be heard. Ava seemed calm as always, but Thomas felt a growing uneasiness. "Have you ever thought about what would happen if someone found out?" Thomas asked quietly, looking around. Ava stopped, looked at him with her deep, thoughtful eyes, and shrugged. "I try not to think about it," she replied. "But it would probably be the end of everything." Thomas nodded, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Something strange had appeared in their surroundings, something they couldn't control. "I don't know how long we can hide it," he added, glancing at Ava. She lowered her head for a moment, as if trying to hide her feelings, but then looked up. "Thomas, I'm scared, but I can't be without you," she admitted, her voice shaking. "No matter what happens, I don't want to lose you." Thomas hugged her, trying to quell his fears, but in that moment, he realized that their bond could not exist forever in the shadows. They could no longer hide, could no longer continue to live in constant fear of exposure. Michael, meanwhile, noticed more and more oddities in Thomas and Ava's behavior. They became withdrawn, as if they were hiding something important from him. Michael tried to question Thomas, but each time he encountered a cold wall of detachment. Thomas began to avoid talking to him, refusing to spend time with him, and Ava almost stopped talking to him altogether. Michael began to suspect that something serious was going on, and his instincts, trained by years of watching people around him, told him it had to do with Ava. He couldn't quite figure out exactly what was going on, but he knew one thing. His best friend was hiding something. One day, when Michael happened to be walking past Thomas's room, he heard muffled voices. Curiosity got the best of him, and he moved closer, trying not to make any noise. Thomas and Ava were talking, their voices quiet but tense. "We have to be careful," Thomas said. "Someone might find out and then—" Michael froze in place. His heart was racing. Thomas and Ava didn't know how long they could keep this forbidden fire burning between them. Their feelings for each other, which had long ago grown from childish affection into something deeper and darker, were no longer controllable. They knew they were walking a knife's edge, balancing between passion and terror, but each time they returned to each other as if it were the only way to breathe. Thomas sat on the steps of their house, his gaze fixed on the setting sun, but his thoughts wandered far away. He couldn't shake off the haunting thought that everything was about to come crashing down. He and Ava had been hiding from reality for far too long, but the end seemed inevitable. It was only a matter of time before their secret was revealed and how they would handle it. Ava, stepping out of the house, sat down next to her brother. She sighed quietly, feeling the same anxiety. They could no longer live under the illusion that their bond would remain a secret. Any word, any wrong move could lead to disaster. But at the same time, they couldn't stop, couldn't give up what seemed right to them, despite all its illegality. "Thomas, we must be more careful," she began without looking at him. Her voice trembled, and she barely concealed the fear that had long since gnawed at her from the inside. "Michael, he suspects something." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. He knew that Michael, his best friend, was starting to notice oddities. Thomas tried to avoid him, but that only attracted more attention. Michael was too savvy not to realize that something was wrong. "I know," Thomas replied quietly. "But we have to hold on. He won't know anything if we're careful." Ava nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. Her heart clenched at the thought that their little world could shatter at any moment. The next day, they decided to meet in an old barn outside of town where they used to play often as children. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could be alone and not be afraid of being seen. For the past month, the barn had become a place where they could immerse themselves in their secret passion, where no one could disturb them. The creaking wood and old boards covered in dust created an atmosphere of abandonment and solitude around them. Thomas sat on the floor looking at Ava, who was standing against the wall, looking thoughtfully at the boarded-up window. "We can't go on like this much longer," she mumbled, her voice low, almost a whisper. "It's killing me. It feels like I'm about to explode." Thomas stood up silently, walked over to Ava, and pulled her to him. Their breathing hitched, and after a moment his lips touched her neck and his hands slid down her back. Thomas kissed her, no longer thinking that anyone could see them. Their embrace became more and more passionate, leaving no room for doubt about what was happening between them. Suddenly, a loud creak of the door broke their moment. Michael stood on the threshold, his eyes widened with horror. The picture that opened before him left no room for confusion. He froze, staring at their proximity. In an instant, everything he had only suspected before became clear to him. "What the hell is going on here?" He gritted his teeth, his voice full of anger and frustration. Ava pulled away from Thomas, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. Thomas stepped forward, trying to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. They both realized this was the end. Michael had seen everything. He knew the truth now. You... Michael seemed stunned. "This is wrong. Are you out of your mind? I'll tell you everything. Your parents. They need to know." Michael started to turn around to leave, but Thomas, driven by panic, rushed forward and grabbed his arm. "Wait! Please! You don't understand!" Thomas tried to speak calmly, but his voice shook. Michael pushed him away, his eyes glittering with rage. "No, Thomas, I understand everything! And this is sick shit! You should have stopped, but you didn't! Ava is your sister! This is sick! I can't let you keep doing this!" Michael wrenched his hand away sharply, his face blazing with rage. "This is the end!" He turned sharply, intending to walk away, but Thomas, realizing that if Michael left, it would be over, lunged at him again, this time harder. Michael stumbled, but continued to resist. "Thomas, what are you doing?" Ava screamed in horror, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. Michael tried to break free, but Thomas, driven by fear and panic, wouldn't let him go. "You can't tell!" Thomas shouted, his voice sounding almost hysterical. "You don't understand anything! It's not just that!" They began to struggle. Michael, always physically stronger, was able to throw Thomas back a few steps, but that only fueled the rage in the latter. He no longer thought about what he was doing. He just wanted to protect his secret. Every second of this fight was bringing them closer to disaster. Ava, who had been standing motionless in shock, suddenly realized that she couldn't just watch. In desperation, she grabbed an old piece of metal pipe lying on the ground. Everything happened in slow motion. Her hands shook as she lifted the pipe above her head and then, driven by panic, brought it down sharply on Michael's head. A deafening thump echoed through the barn. Michael froze in place, his eyes widening in pain and surprise as he slowly began to fall to the ground. Thomas recoiled in horror, unable to believe his eyes. "What have you done?" Thomas exclaimed, unable to take his eyes off his friend's body. Ava, trembling, let go of the pipe, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe it had really happened. "I didn't mean to." Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. "Thomas, I didn't mean to." They both stood over Michael's body, unable to move. Their best friend's life was gone in an instant, and now they were both murderers. Thomas slowly knelt down in front of Michael's body, his hands shaking. He placed his hand on his friend's chest but felt no pulse. It was all over. Panic swept over Thomas and Ava's heads as soon as their arms, which until a few minutes ago had been embracing each other, were stained with Michael's blood. They stood in silence, trying to realize what had just happened. Their hearts were pounding frantically, and every sound seemed louder and sharper than usual. The sense of unreality of what was happening had taken over them so much that they just stood there staring at the body lying in front of them, unable to move. Ava was the first to break the silence. "What have we done? Thomas, what now?" Her voice trembled, but it was no longer panic, only confusion and fear. Thomas could hardly breathe. He looked at the hands that had been clutching Michael a moment ago, and the horror of what he had done paralyzed him. He exhaled sharply, and as if awakened, turned to Ava. "We can't leave it like this. No one can find out what happened. If they find out—" He didn't finish, realizing he'd already said too much. The words stuck in his throat, leaving only the taste of despair. Ava, all shaky, wrapped her arms around herself as if she could hide in her own body from this horror. But one thing was certain: they couldn't let the world know their secret. Michael's murder wasn't random, but it wasn't planned either. It was fear, panic, a desperate act driven by the moment. "We need to get rid of the body," Thomas said coldly, though he was torn inside. He didn't look at Ava, trying to hide his own panic that bubbled beneath his superficial calm. Ava nodded, not yet realizing that their lives were forever changed from now on. She tried to remember everything she'd seen in movies about murders, about how to cover their tracks, but at that moment, her mind was filled only with thoughts of Michael and how everything had gone wrong. "But how do we do this?" she asked, barely audible, her voice shaking with terror. Thomas looked at her, and his eyes were full of emptiness. He realized that they had no choice. If they confessed, their lives would be ruined. If concealed, they had a chance to continue living. Though inwardly, he knew that life would never be the same again. "We'll bury him somewhere in the woods, away from here. No one will find him if we do it right," he said coldly, as if he were thinking out loud, not trying to reassure Ava. They decided to act quickly. Thomas and Ava, sensing that time was working against them, wrapped Michael's body in an old blanket they found in the shed behind the house, and without a word, carried it to the car. They drove in silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts. The trees glimmering outside the window seemed insurmountable obstacles in their way, but the road led them on, and at that moment it seemed to them that the whole world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them and this terrible load. The next morning, the police received a call from Michael's parents. He hadn't come home the previous night and his cell phone had been disconnected. This immediately caught the attention of detectives Marcus Brown and Kristen Jenkins. Michael was a teenager, but always came home on time, never leaving his parents in the dark about his movements. This situation was highly unusual. "What's the plan?" Kristen asked, leafing through the file with Michael's information. They were sitting in the police station, preparing to begin their investigation. "We'll start with his friends, see who he was with the night before," Marcus answered, his face serious, his gaze focused. "Teenagers don't just disappear. He could have had problems that his parents don't know about." They drove to the school where Michael attended. The students, unaccustomed to detectives walking the hallways, spoke in whispers. The detectives began interviewing his friends and teachers, finding out what had happened in the last few days. Thomas and Ava were also being questioned. Their gazes met only for a moment, each of them trying to look as natural as possible, though inside they were both burning with fear. Thomas tried to convince himself that they would get through this, that no one would find out what had happened. He prepared answers to the questions, repeating them in his head like a mantra. "Were you close to Michael?" Kristen asked, watching Thomas's reaction. Thomas coughed nervously, feeling the detective's attention focus on him. "Yeah, we've been friends since we were kids," he replied, avoiding Kristen's gaze, trying to hide his nervousness. "And when was the last time you saw him?" Marcus asked his question. Thomas froze for a second, but quickly pulled himself together. "Yesterday at practice. We split up as usual, nothing out of the ordinary." Ava was questioned as well, and although she managed to keep relatively calm, the tension was felt in her entire demeanor. She avoided talking about Michael, pretended to be too busy with her own affairs. When the interviews were over, the detectives began to piece together the facts. Michael had disappeared after his meeting with Thomas, but his friends and teachers hadn't noticed anything strange. But one thing remained unclear. What had happened between Michael and Thomas in the last few days? "I think Thomas is hiding something," Kristen said as they discussed the initial findings. "He's too nervous. Maybe they had a fight with Michael?" "It's possible," Marcus answered. "We need to check their relationship more closely." He clearly had some secret. The pressure on Thomas and Ava increased every day. They couldn't sleep well. Their nerves were on edge. Ava stopped going out of the house, afraid that every person she met would notice her panic. Thomas tried to behave as usual, but his behavior increasingly attracted attention. One evening, when they met outside the house to discuss what to do next, Ava burst into tears. "I can't live like this anymore. We have to do something, Thomas. I can't take another interrogation session. They'll figure it out for sure." Her voice was soaked with despair. Thomas tried to calm her down, but he felt that the situation was getting out of control. The more they tried to hide their actions, the more they were falling into their own trap. Detectives Brown and Jenkins plunged into an investigation that grew stranger and more controversial with each passing day. Michael's disappearance seemed like something completely out of the ordinary. An ordinary teenager with no apparent problems suddenly vanished. The detectives were certain it was not a runaway, much less an accident. Michael had disappeared because he'd been helped to disappear, and now it was their job to figure out who and why. Kristen Jenkins, studying the details of the interrogations, found more and more inconsistencies in Thomas and Ava's testimony. Although their answers were well rehearsed, in little details they were confused, confusing, and their behavior was suspicious. Thomas seemed overly nervous, avoiding direct eye contact, and Ava looked depressed, clearly trying not to show her inner torment. "They're hiding something serious," Kristen said, leafing through the case files. Marcus, more experienced and used to complex cases, nodded. "Yes, I too have a feeling that there's more to it than that. But we don't have any direct evidence yet. Without Michael's body, we can't nail them down." Their main question was one: where is Michael? Without an answer, all further speculation and conjecture remained mere theories. Meanwhile, Thomas and Ava lived like a volcano, dreading every phone call, every knock on the door. Their lives became an endless paranoia. They increasingly avoided communicating with each other, but at the same time they felt that they were connected by something much deeper, a shared terrible secret. Thomas came home one evening and found Ava sitting in the kitchen. Her hands were shaking and her eyes were full of tears. "Thomas, I can't take it anymore. They know. I feel like the detectives have already figured it out," she whispered. Thomas sat down next to her, trying to take her hand, but she pulled away. "If they find the body, it's over. We should have left, run away. But now it's too late." Ava wiped away her tears, but her panic was only growing. "No one will find him. We did the right thing," Thomas replied, though he wasn't sure of what he was saying. The next day, the thing they were so afraid of happened. The forester, walking with his hunting dogs, came across a piece of land that looked suspiciously dug up. The dogs were immediately attracted to the place. They started digging and barking loudly. The forester, realizing that the matter was serious, called the police. When detectives arrived at the scene, they found a buried body. It was Michael. He had a deep gash on his head and was wrapped in an old bedspread. This confirmed Brown and Jenkins' worst fears. They now had every reason to believe that Michael had been murdered. "It's going to get a lot easier now," Marcus said as he looked around. "We've got the body, we just need to find the weapon and figure out who did it." A few days later, while walking through the school where Michael, Thomas, and Ava went to school, Kristen happened to come across a board with class pictures. One of the pictures, taken a few years ago, caught her eye and caught a detail that seemed strangely familiar to her. In the background of a domestic scene, children smiling as they sat on a couch, she saw an old bedspread that seemed to be exactly like the one Michael's corpse had been wrapped in. Kristen froze, looking at the picture. The soft pattern and faded color all matched the bedspread found at the crime scene. She called over to the teacher in charge of the blackboard and asked him for the photo so she could study it more closely. "This is from the alumni archives," the teacher said, holding out the photo to Kristen. "It was taken during one of the home visits. This is Ava and Thomas's house." Kristen nodded and took the picture, thanking the teacher. Now she had a clear hint. She decided to check out that detail and headed to Thomas and Ava's house. When Kristen knocked on the door, she was greeted by Thomas and Ava's unsuspecting parents. Good afternoon. I'm Detective Jenkins. I have a few questions about an item," she began, pulling out a photograph and showing it to the parents. "Do you recognize this bedspread?" Thomas's mother looked at the picture, frowning slightly as if trying to remember. "Oh, yes," she finally answered. "It's an old bedspread that used to be on our couch in the living room. It was so worn out that I put it in the shed. I thought about throwing it away, but I never got around to it." Kristen felt her heart beat faster. That bedspread was the very evidence that linked Thomas and Ava's house to the crime. Was it still there, in the barn? Kristen asked cautiously, remaining calm, though anticipation gripped her inside. "I think so. I hadn't looked in there in a while. It's just been lying there, not bothering anyone. Probably covered in dust." Her mother shrugged. Kristen realized she had found the crucial clue. She thanked her parents and, with permission, looked around the barn to make sure the blanket was gone. Her hunch was confirmed. Only muddy footprints remained where it should have been lying. That meant that someone had taken it recently, and that someone was Thomas and Ava. Kristen returned to Marcus with a copy of the photo and told him about her findings. "This isn't just a coincidence," she said, placing the photo in front of him. "It's a bedspread from their parents' house. It was used to wrap Michael's body. Now we can pin them against the wall." Marcus, after studying the photo and listening to Kristen, nodded with a serious expression on his face. "We have everything we need. We haven't found the crime weapon, but now we have evidence linking them to the body." The next meeting with Thomas and Ava was a turning point. When they were called in for questioning, they hadn't expected such specific questions. Kristen and Marcus decided not to show their cards right away, but gradually, step by step, corralled them. "Thomas, Ava, we found Michael's body, and the bedspread it was wrapped in," Kristen began, watching their reactions intently. "It's the bedspread from your house. We have a photograph to prove it." Thomas's face turned pale, and Ava couldn't hide the surge of fear on her face. They looked at each other for support but said nothing. "Your mother said that this blanket had been in the barn for years," Kristen continued, giving them no chance to deny it. "But it's not there now." "What do you mean by that?" Thomas asked in a shaky voice, trying to keep his composure. "I mean that you, Thomas, and you, Ava, knew about this blanket, and you knew that it could be used to get rid of Michael's body when you killed him." Kristen paused, watching their reactions carefully. Ava began to cry, realizing that they were cornered. Thomas tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. At that moment, they both realized that they could no longer hide the truth. Marcus, watching, added, "We know that you were the last people to see Michael alive. We also know that you had a fight." Thomas closed his eyes as if preparing for the inevitable. Ava, sobbing, snuggled into his palms, realizing that their world was finally shattered. "We didn't mean for things to turn out this way," Thomas whispered. "We loved each other. Michael threatened to tell us everything. We didn't know what to do. It all happened too fast." Ava sat beside him, her face dead pale. She could no longer hold back her tears. "We loved each other. We couldn't hold it back any longer. But Michael, he caught us. He threatened to tell everyone." Her voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. She couldn't go on, but it was already clear. Marcus and Kristen stared at them, realizing that this love had turned out to be not just a mistake, but a true tragedy that had led to the death of an innocent man. "Did you kill him to protect your secret?" Marcus asked quietly. Thomas nodded, his face contorted with pain and realization. "We didn't think. We were scared, panicked. It happened so fast." Thomas's voice trailed off and he sobbed, unable to bear the weight of what he had done. Ava looked at him, crying, realizing that this was the end. Their lives had been ruined, and for what? For the love that could not be hidden and that had led them to the worst crime of all. The finale was inevitable. Thomas and Ava confessed everything that happened that night. Their fear of exposure was stronger than common sense, and they chose the path that led them to their deaths. Not only Michael's, but their own lives. As the detectives led them away in handcuffs, Thomas and Ava looked at each other one last time. Their love, which had lived in secret for so long, had caused the biggest tragedy of their lives. Now they will forever be bound not only by their feelings, but also by the bloody crime they committed together.